So the third book that I want to talk about within this spotlight session on archaeology is a much smaller book and considerably more recent. This is Eastern Exploration, Past and Future, Lectures at the Royal Institution by W.M. Flinders Petrie. And this was published in 1918 and we received it into the museum collection in 1918. So this is another one that we acquired as soon as it was published. And this is a book, as it says, by William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Flinders Petrie was born in 1853 and he lived until 1942, and he is known as one of the most key Egyptologists, pioneer of the systematic archaeological method, and one of the very first people to publish on the notion of dating archaeological layers based on the ceramic finds within them. However, he is also a somewhat controversial figure, being as how he was a very adamant supporter of notions of eugenics and white supremacy, and also published some very anti-democratic views. So as a person, he is a big dichotomy between very important and insightful developments that he brought in and his own personal views, which he was not quiet about and which we nowadays would find very distasteful. So, his father was William Petrie and his mother was Anne, and her maiden name was Flinders. So he was given the name William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Anne was the daughter of Matthew Flinders, who was a captain of the ship that undertook the first circumnavigation of Australia. So he was from a kind of well-known and influential family anyway. Flinders Petrie had an interest in archaeology from a very young age. As a teenager, he undertook archaeological surveys in Britain, and he came to prominence in 1880 with a survey of the Giza pyramids, the Great Pyramids at Giza, just outside Cairo. And this survey was very well received. It was lauded for being very accurate, very methodical, and it also included his own lament for the destruction of monuments and finds that was going on in Egypt at the time. So based on the back of this, he became associated with the Egypt Exploration Fund and came under the patronage of Amelia Edwards. Now, Amelia Edwards was a novelist, a journalist, and one of the co-founders of the Egypt Exploration Fund, which was set up in order to raise awareness and raise money for exploration of Egyptian antiquities and rescue of Egyptian antiquities by European powers. So on her death in 1892, she bequeathed her Egyptian collection to the University College of London with an endowment to set up the UK's first chair of Egyptology at a university, with also the instruction that this chair should be given to Flinders Petrie. So he then, at that point, 1892, he became chair of Egyptology at UCL, and the university then funded his subsequent digs within Egypt. A little while before that, he had also started digging in Palestine, and he became equally known for his work in the Holy Land as he was for his work in Egypt. He was knighted in 1923. He retired in 1933 and moved to Jerusalem, where he lived until his death in 1942. And interestingly, at his death, he donated his head and therefore his brain to the Royal College of Surgeons in London. And there's a story about his preserved head being transported to the Royal College of Surgeons in London, and of course because it was wartime everything was a little bit up in the air, and apparently it lost its label, so for many decades nobody knew whose head it was that was within the stores at the Royal College of Surgeons, until it was eventually identified, reunited with the information about it, and is now still kept preserved there. In 1896, Flinders Petrie married Hilda Erlin, who was in her own right a geologist, and they worked together throughout their married life to the point where she undertook digs on her own, and she became very well respected as an archaeologist in her own right, as well as being the wife of Flinders Petrie. So this particular book is Again, looking at the classifications, this is another different classification. So this book is classified in the CB section, and CB is travel. And again, you can see there is potentially some logic there. This is talking about particularly Palestine and Mesopotamia, and about the work that has been done there and how this should be taken forward. So there is some logic behind this being classified as a travel book rather than as a book of antiquities, and in a way it is more about the process of archaeology rather than about the antiquities themselves. But again, it's another interesting divergence from the notion that all our archaeological books would be under antiquities in the CC section. So this book in itself is quite interesting. It is a record of 2 lectures that Flinders Petrie gave to the Royal Institution, and it was published in 1918. So it's published, we acquired it in September 1918, so this was clearly published before the war actually ended, the First World War, but it was at a time where it was becoming clear that it was likely that the continent was in the final throes of the First World War. So within this book, Flinders Petrie considers the political situation within Palestine and Mesopotamia and what's going to happen there after the war, and how the politics should be related and should think about the antiquities and the future excavation and future exploration of the antiquities within those countries. So Palestine obviously is the Holy Land, the area between the Mediterranean and the River Jordan, and it was previously part of the Ottoman Empire. During the First World War, the Ottomans supported Germany and the Central Powers, and as part of the war, they were driven from the region by the British. So the British-led Egyptian Expeditionary Force captured Jerusalem at the end of 1917 and occupied the whole area by September 1918. Mesopotamia, which is the other area which is mentioned specifically in this work, is the lands between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, which in modern day terms is parts of Syria, most of Iraq, and parts of southeastern Turkey. And Mesopotamia was also part of the Ottoman Empire. So in a separate campaign, the British also drove the Ottomans from Mesopotamia. They captured Baghdad in 1917, and after the war, there was a League of Nations mandate in both these areas, which was administered by the British. So effectively, the British came into control of both Palestine and Mesopotamia after the war. So this book, these lectures that Flinders Petrie gave, were given at a time when this wasn't completely settled, but that there were clearly ideas that there would be very strong British influence in the politics of these areas after the war, now that the Ottoman Empire had been removed from the areas. So the book uses examples from Egypt and Cyprus, so from Flinders Petrie's previous work, to show what can go wrong and how sites and artefacts can be destroyed. And politically, in a way, this involves some quite modern thinking. So he talks about the establishment of boards for antiquities with government control, but including museum staff and inspectors of antiquities, and notes the need to protect antiquities in planning legislation, which is something that wasn't really brought in the UK until considerably later in the 20th century. And talks about how it's sensible to offer the full market value for fines and rewards for information on new discoveries, in order that the government, the boards for antiquities, are the best buyer and therefore secure the information and the fines in order to try and cut down on the black market for these kinds of things. So the information that he's talking about, the suggestions he's making in this book, are quite sensible and are quite modern in their thinking. One does wonder how high up the agenda of setting up the political administration of these areas following 4 years of World War how high up the notion of protecting antiquities would come. But it's really interesting to read this and to read the things that Flinders Petrie was arguing for at this point, because it very much does support his reputation as an innovator, an important proponent of the scientific and systematic archaeological work, and the way that that follows through into broader issues and political issues and things which are still being argued about now. So it's an interesting book, and it's, in a way, it's a shame that it's almost impossible to think about Flinders Petrie and to read his work without being very much aware of his ideas and notions, which do come through in some of the things that he says about native workers and about the inferiority of people in the area who live and who have lived in the areas that he was excavating.